Let me start really by asking you, since you're here, why you ever became a journalist? What is it? I mean, I can't recall from our early conversations back then, but what is it that drove you to want to be a journalist? By the way, you do call yourself a journalist, don't you?
I certainly do. Yeah. I certainly do. And although it took me a long time to believe that that was what I was, and in fact I joined the NUJ and was rather astonished when I applied and was accepted, simply to prove that I was a journalist. So I do consider myself a journalist, and I've always been very happy to be a journalist. I'm rather proud to be a journalist, actually. Or not that I think it's a respectable trade. I don't think it's a respectable trade, nor do I think it should be a respectable trade, and I certainly don't think it's a profession. And I'm bored stiff by people who think that it is a profession. And one of the reasons it seems to me that our trade is so appalling in places like France or other ridiculous countries, is because they do consider it to be a profession and respectable and part of the constitutional process. So I don't know, why did I become a journalist? I mean, the bugger about life is, you have to live it forwards, but you can only understand it backwards. And when I look back, I can see that I was a square peg in a square hole, because I love words and I'm naturally curious. But at the time, when I left university, I applied for loads of jobs, and many of which were journalistic, but I was turned down for all of them as I was turned down for everything else. From the Foreign Office, rightly in my view, shows they've got rather a good selection system. I'd have been a hopeless diplomat. Through to my brother became
your brother's a diplomat.
Yeah, one of my brothers, is a diplomat. He emailed me. He emailed me last week, saying that he had to spend a lot of time doing work on climate change, and he had a high-level meeting with the Mexican environment. He's the ambassador in Mexico at present. High-level meeting with the Mexican environment minister, which has unfortunately been largely taken up with the environment minister's concerns about the state of Marks & Sparks underpants. No, I was turned down for everything, including that, and rightly so, and probably rightly so for the journalistic things. But I can't be more precise than that, I'm afraid.
I remember you in Brighton, but it's a long time ago for both of us. But
a high point of both our careers.
Indeed, indeed.
The high point.
You have been going up ever since.
No, that's all. You went on to edit the Mirror after that. I never quite understood.
I still maintain my point. But anyway, the truth is that you didn't ruffle anyone in Brighton. But soon after that, the next time I really heard about you, you were in Northern Ireland causing all sorts of trouble. So do you think that's because you see journalists as, not muckrakers, because that's a rather ridiculous phrase, but journalists causing, you kind of came up against the authorities in Northern Ireland? Explain, because I think most people won't remember, actually.
I'm afraid I don't remember either. But
yes, you do. Yes, you do.
I don't remember the details, but then there were a series of incidents. Yes. And do I think it's our job to be
confrontational, difficult?
Well, confrontational is wrong, I think, but it doesn't. Sometimes
I'm going to ask you about being.
Sometimes you have to be. Don't be so bloody argumentative. No, sometimes you have to be confrontational, I think, but I don't think that he's necessarily. That's the only thing you should be. But I do think that it's your job to be an irritant to some degree, yes. And I'm very sorry that I wasn't more of an irritant in Brighton. Everlasting regret. But certainly it is the case that I found in Northern Ireland that it was a place. It was a wonderful, wonderful place to learn a lot very quickly. Not many people wanted to go and work there. One, two, it had everything in microcosm. It had its own government and civil service and its rather mad politics, and it had in addition this war going on, so it meant that every day you were out on some sort of bombing or shooting or whatever at a very young age, and that was absolutely terrific. But there was definitely a school of thought that said that it wasn't the function of the journalists there to rock the boat. and there were many boats to be rocked. So,
but after that, you did what I would call rather mundane tasks, because you read the news and you worked on breakfast news or something.
No, you missed out several years, but yeah, I did.
I'm speeding them through.
That's very boring. We'll get on to something interesting in a minute, I hope, or we can go and have dinner. But no, I did have a period reading the news. You're right, and it is. It's not an occupation for an adult. There's no question about that. It's. I think it was Michael Burke who described reading the news as reading aloud. Do you remember you did it at primary school? Reading aloud. That's really what it is. There's which is not to say that conveying a certain plausibility in the process isn't important. Of course it is. I'm just saying that it's not a satisfying or satisfactory occupation. And I did do it, and when I first did it, I lasted 6 months. At the time I was writing a book about Central America,
yeah,
and I had no income, and I got a phone call one day saying we're going to start a new 6 o'clock news. They're always doing this, a new this, a new that, same old slot. Anyway, a new 6 o'clock news, and it's going to be, the language is so dead, isn't it? An early evening information package. And anyway, would you like to come and read the news 2 days a week as a relief newsreader for Sue Lawley and who was it? Nicholas Witchell. So I had no income, so I was very happy to do it 2 days a week. But I still only lasted 6 months. It was fine. That's absolutely fine. But it wasn't something you want to do long term. Or I want to do long term. I don't decry those who wish to do it as an occupation. It just wasn't for me.
And then, I am speeding on, but let's get to 1989, which you won't remember, but it's almost 20 years ago, which is when you started on Newsnight. Did you know that?
Yep. Is it?
Yeah. So,
well, if you say so,
yeah.
I imagine you've looked at the cuttings.
I have.
Right, good. Your point is, caller?
And the point is this. You said earlier, you found yourself a square peg in a square hole. At Newsnight, after the blandness of reading the news and doing other things, did you suddenly say to yourself, "This is what I was born to do"?
Oh God, no, no, certainly not. And very often I go home thinking, God, you really fucked that up. So no, I don't. I actually have never thought that. I do think I love it, of course. It's like any kind of daily journalism. Some days are wonderful. They're like, well, I've never been surfing, but it's what I imagine surfing to be like, and some days it's like swimming in treacle, and that's just how it is. That's the nature of daily journalism. But I love it, and I work with clever and talented people, and I adore all of that. However, it has its frustrations. Yesterday being a case in point.
Yes. You look very bored yesterday.
I was.
You actually
I was trying to be professional and not looking bored, but I understand.
You looked so incredibly bored. You said to Mr. Mason at one point about Northern Rock. It sounded like this. Oh God. Tell us something about this. I couldn't really give a damn.
I was rather surprised. See, it was about Northern Rock. I thought he'd be much more excited. He wasn't really.
You can't get excited about whether it be nationalised or whether it won't be nationalised.
Well, if you're an economics correspondent, you can.
You seemed utterly bored. But in fact, I thought this was a great moment, an enjoyable moment for me, because I thought, now you're beginning to be rude to your own correspondents.
You're a very cheeky bugger, aren't you?
Hey, talk about cheek. You're incredibly cheeky. I mean, I wouldn't ask the Prime Minister if he got on his knees and prayed with George Bush.
I didn't mention his knees. Well, why not?
Okay, no, so let me take you over the style that everyone goes on about. I mean, there's a word in the English language now called Paxman-esque. And what it suggests is aggression, rudeness, confrontation, the word you just denied. Do you think that's the method that you employ? Are you conscious of being confrontational, aggressive, rude?
No. I mean, if you want I know you won't believe me, but no. I mean, I
believe
do.
every word you say.
I think look, I think it's really simple. Nobody voted for me, and in that sense I have no entitlement to hold forth, and what my political views are is neither here nor there. However, I happen to have the opportunity to ask questions of powerful people. It seems to me that you kind of intuitively try to think yourself into the frame of mind that, what would the average reasonably intelligent viewer wish to see asked? And frequently I'm sure one gets that wrong. But when you've done that, you must make sure that you get an answer. Now, we can talk about the mechanics of interviews if you want later on, but we talk about it now. But very often there's the person you're interviewing over here and you're over here. This transaction occurs in a currency which has not been distributed evenly. It's basically about information. One person possesses the information, the other person is trying to find it out. If you have decided what it is you wish to find out, it seems to me that you owe it to the viewer to try to continue to discern what it is you've set out to discover, or for it to become abundantly clear that the person from whom you're making the inquiry is not prepared to tell you. And until one of those points has been reached, the thing should continue. Now, sometimes, as you say, it is confrontational. Sometimes, the word I really don't like actually is, and you didn't use it to be fair to you, the word I don't like is sneering. And that's quite often been used. And I think it's probably to do with the fact that I look like a horse, it's the way my face is. That's just how it is. But I'm not sneering. I genuinely do have a respect for the office. But it behoves you, it seems to me, once you set out on this journey, to finish it. And if you don't finish it, you've let down the people on whose behalf you're asking the questions. Now, is there any greater entitlement? Do I have any greater entitlement than anybody else? No, I don't. Of course I don't. But the one thing I do have that most people haven't got, or many people haven't got, is not entitlement but opportunity. And if you have that opportunity, it seems to me that you should use it to what you, in your clunking, ham-fisted way, think is in their interests. And that's the long and the short of it. It's not at all sophisticated, and I am very, very willing to concede that on many occasions one gets it wrong, and I'm also perfectly willing to concede that sometimes one has approached it in entirely the wrong way. So sometimes you come at it thinking, I'm going to ask them this because it's an impossible question to answer. Sometimes you think, if I ask them this, they are likely to say X, Y, or Z, and then I can follow it up with whatever it is. Sometimes it's effective to come at them from the left when they're expecting an attack from the right, or from the right when they're expecting an attack from the left. Humour sometimes works very well, and sometimes not. If they don't get the joke, it's embarrassing. But there's lots of different ways of doing it. But in each case, what you're trying to do is to find a way through this carapace that they all carry nowadays, because they are all, almost anyone, it seems to me, who appears in who occupies the sort of role where they're likely to have to be interviewed about what they do or what they represent or for whom they speak, they have all been trained in how to deal with interviews. And that may well involve a quite sophisticated level of not answering the question. And you must keep the question in mind. That's why they sometimes appear confrontational. And you must continue until such point as you've got an answer. Now, you may say that... I'm sorry, I'll shut up. Go on.
Let me ask you this, because I think a lot of people here won't know. I know a bit of it. About the amount of preparation you do. Because people often see the end result. They see you question somebody and they think, he's done that off the top of his head. How did he know that fact? Whatever. People think, does he turn up to the studio half an hour before he goes on? I know you don't, and so on. So can I just run over the amount of preparation you do for each interview that you do?
Well, the short answer is not enough, really.
Yeah.
I mean, no, very, very rarely. I mean, clearly it varies. Sometimes you go down to the studio not having done any homework at all, doubtless to the frustration and irritation of one's colleagues. That's the worst thing, actually. The worst thing is that sense that when you really make a mess of it, that sense that you've let down your colleagues or you've let down the viewer. And I mean, I don't say it happens every night, but it happens quite frequently, and that is quite. If it's because you haven't, sometimes it's because things haven't gone the way you thought they would go, or you've missed the point completely, and no amount of homework could have divined the point in advance. But if it is because you've not done enough homework, then I think that's a very bad state of affairs. But most times you're right. You do try to work out. You try to brief yourself a bit. Yes.
Have you been defeated lots of times? Can you remember who's defeated?
Well, you see, you're using the wrong terminology. You're saying defeated.
Yeah, because but it is a gladiator sport, isn't it?
Well, so it is according to you. I don't see it as that. No. Sometimes it is. Yes, of course it is. Sometimes it is. It is in the blue corner and in the orange corner. Sometimes it's like that. Most times it's not. Most interviews are very, very simple journalistic interrogatives.
Yeah.
Who, when, where, why, how. They're not of the kind that you're talking about.
But politicians, you talked about the carapace. But politicians have really come up now. I don't know if this has changed. I don't know if you've noticed from your 18 years of doing the same job, how sophisticated they've. I'm sorry,
boring.
I know. How sophisticated they've become at avoiding. They test themselves. Can I take Paxman? Can I actually cope with him? That's how they test it. So they go through lots of training. Don't you think is that something you're aware of, and then do you have to set out to beat them, and does that not make it gladiatorial?
Well, I mean, I fully accept that's out there. I understand that. And we had an MP on last week. Was it? No, sorry, 2 weeks ago. I'd never seen this man before, and he'd been told. You remember that Beyond the Fringe sketch? At this stage of the war, what we need is a futile gesture.
Yeah, futile gesture.
Yeah, no member of the cabinet, a junior minister, or any chairman of a select committee or anything would go up. And this poor old bloke had said, I don't think I'll name him.
No.
He said, "Oh well, I'll do it," and he did it. And he very proudly said before, I haven't been attacked by you before. And that was a very odd situation. I felt rather sorry for him. I was rather nice to him. But I'm aware it's out there, but I can't do anything about that.
Are you nervous before you do these things? I mean, is it now so second nature? You walk on set and you're, easy, whatever, you can cope with any problem?
I'm always nervous, yes. Yes, to a degree. I'm obviously more nervous about some things than others. I mean, if you've got to go... If all you have to do is to interview, for example, Paul Mason about what's happened with Northern Rock, which isn't called an interview, it's called a two-way. If you have to interview Paul Mason about Northern Rock, or Stephanie Flanders about the state of the economy, or Michael Crick about whatever the latest infratamiente is in Westminster, that is clearly not as nerve-wracking as it is having to interview the Chancellor of the Exchequer about the state of the economy, which happened to me in a horrifying way about 3 weeks ago, with the words, and it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I thought, never mind, it was more Northern Rockery, and I thought, well, I've got plenty of time before 10:30 to mug up on that, and then the words were uttered, "You've got Alistair Darling in 5 minutes," and I thought, Christ, Northern Rock, well, it's a bank. And that concentrates the mind a bit. And the most difficult ones, we're talking, all of these examples are about British domestic politics, and I suppose realistically that's our bread and butter. But
yes.
If you have to go down to Downing Street to interview the Prime Minister, there is still a part of me And I've not been to Downing Street that many times, actually. I could probably, you know, finger all digits added together would certainly more than cover it. There's a part of me that thinks when you go in there, what am I doing here? And I think lots of journalists have this feeling, and if we don't have that feeling, frankly, we've succumbed to hubris, and you know, we shouldn't be doing our job. But then you must remember why you're there, and that I think does concentrate the mind a bit, and the stakes are a great deal higher because those sort of interviews tend to be big set pieces which may run in a freestanding program of their own.
You did Tony Blair just before the Iraq War, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
In which he kind of chose you, do you think? Because he thought, I'm going to put myself up for the most difficult interview I could face.
I don't know. You'd have to ask Alistair Campbell, who was doing the job at the time, whether that's the case. But, I mean, I only know it from our side. But to a degree, you must be right.
Yeah.
We had asked Number 10 if we could do Blair with an audience of people outside London. We did it eventually in Gateshead, and before the Iraq War. Now, of course, he must have had other invitations, and he accepted, I think, one other invitation, which was a Trevor McDonald thing, which is a rather different sort of kettle of fish. And
yeah.
I mean, they accepted. So, clearly he did then, or they made a choice, and. You know, let's be realistic about it. If you are a prominent, powerful person, and you have a choice between appearing on Newsnight and having a difficult time, and appearing somewhere else, let's not name any names, appearing somewhere else and having a predictably much easier time or a different kind of time, it requires you make a judgment about where you need to appear. And I think a judgment probably was taken there. We need to be seen to be answering difficult questions. So maybe you're right. Maybe choose is the right word.
How did you feel you dealt with him that day? Did you feel you really gave him a tough time?
I felt it was fairly robust. Could it have been done better? Yes, it always can be done better. But to be frank with you, I don't... I mean, you think about it at the time, and you always, or I always suffer from l'esprit d'escalier, when you think, oh, God, why didn't I say that? Or when he said so and so, why didn't I remind him of?
Yeah.
That happens, I think, all the time. Did I think it had been worthwhile? Yes, I did think it was worthwhile. I thought we learned quite a lot. Could it have been done better? Undoubtedly. Would it have been done better had I done more homework? Possibly, I doubt it. Would it have been... That's not true of other things. Of course, many things I have failed on would have been done better if I'd done more homework. But I don't think that was true in that case. Was there another way of doing it? Overall, and I'm reluctant to say this because it sounds so fucking smug, but I thought overall it wasn't bad, actually.
All right. And by the way, I agree, but I'm not here to agree. But I wonder whether there's sometimes when you all of us, I mean, who work in journalism, and I'm a writer, and I look at my stuff 6 months on, 3 months on, 1 week after, and I think, geez, why did I do that? And you're doing the same with your interviews, so we all look back at our work and wonder. But I wonder whether you actually come off sometimes and absolutely regret something, think, I just absolutely... Let me give you an example, because I'm very rarely critical of you in print, but I was extremely critical of you over the treatment of George Galloway during the election, when you kept banging away saying, are you proud of having put out a black woman from Bethnal Green, which I felt was a hugely unfair question, but you hammered away and he was upset, and I hold no particular candle for George Galloway. Did you not go home and think to myself, I was a bit bloody awful really there?
Roy, it was at, what, 4:30 in the morning?
Yeah, I know, that's me, me, still watching you at 4:30.
You need help! No, it was in the early hours of the morning, and the other thing, what you haven't said, and what, George's friends don't say, is that it followed a discussion between 3 MPs, which was about representation in the House of Commons.
It was. I agree about that.
Therefore, the question of the ethnicity of Una King was, a way into it. Was it, the only way into it? Clearly, it wasn't. Was it, appropriate? I think I'd still defend it. If I had been George Galloway, if you had been George Galloway, if it hadn't been 4:30 in the morning and we were all very tired, you might well have answered, look, Una King's ethnicity is neither here nor there. What is at issue is her cheerleading for the Iraq War, which the people of Bethnal Green are really angry about. And off you'd go. But he didn't do that.
No.
Now, he was tired, I was tired, everyone was tired, I suppose. But, was it brilliant? No, I don't think it was brilliant. It was woke us all up a bit. But, could it have been done better and differently? Yeah, I'm sure it could.
I'm going to come on to a different
can.
subject. One last question, really, in which I'm sure it's difficult for you to simply speak so freely and openly about this. But I am terribly concerned about the state of modern politics, and a lot of people are. I wonder whether you feel, and I'll couch it in media terms therefore, whether you feel that the state of modern politics is the result of an inquiring 24-hour beast called the media. I'm actually giving you an argument laid down by our dear friend Alistair Campbell. Or do you think that the problem here is politicians themselves and politics itself rather than the media? In other words, did we create this problem, or did politics create it itself? It's a big question.
It's a very, very big question, which demands a very, very big answer, but I'll attempt to abbreviate it. I agree with you. I think there is a crisis of confidence in modern politics. I also, I think, agree with you, or agree with your implied suggestion that the media must take some of the responsibility for that. Do they take all the responsibility for it? Not at all. I think it's to do with a number of things. I think it's to do with the way in which promises are made nowadays in a very, very visible way, and life turns out to be more complicated than that. It's to do with the fact that the party system requires politicians to reduce politics to idiotic binary choices about my opponent's way is nonsense, my way is the right way. It's to do with the moribund format in which much of modern political life is conducted in the House of Commons, for example. And yes, it probably is to do with something about the way in which the media report politics. Is it also the case that the media make a lot of noise? Yes. Is it also the case that we do things like instinctively jeer, "Hey, done a U-turn," when actually it seems to me a mark of maturity to change your mind about something? Yes, we do that. Do I think that we by and large treat all politicians as a bunch of crooks and scoundrels? No, I don't. Do I think that I'm sorry, I hate politicians do this, don't they? Ask themselves questions and then answer them. But no, I think there are a lot of problems here, and we have some responsibility for the fact that politics is held in the current regard. However, we should also accept the possibility, it seems to me, that the fact that so many people are disengaged from the political process may not itself be an unhealthy thing. It may be a sign of a reasonably happy society, that people have other things in their lives to be concerned about than simply turning out to support politicians or even to vote in elections. Now, my personal prejudice is that you must vote, as you must pay your taxes. It's part of the deal. You live in society, you vote, you pay your taxes. And if you don't vote, you completely disenfranchise yourself when it comes to passing comment about politics and politicians. And I have no sympathy whatsoever with those people who say, "Oh, I don't vote, they're all the bloody same, aren't they?" Mind you, that Ken Livingstone or that Boris Johnson or whatever it is. No, shut up. You can't be bothered to vote, just shut up. But one of the reasons people don't vote, I think, may be because they have other things that give them pleasure in life or they consider more important in life. The great ideological divide isn't there any longer. Perhaps it'll come back, perhaps in a different form. One can see issues around which it might crystallize. But it isn't there, and that, I think, is one of the reasons people aren't energized by it. So I think there is a problem. There's a problem of disengagement. There's a problem of the regard in which the political process is held, and we have some role in that, but it may not be entirely a consequence of bad things.
Let me change the whole tone of this conversation and
not pants.
Not pants. Not pants.
Hey, you can do pants. I don't care. I will have a straw poll very shortly.
I'm going to leave pants. I'm going to leave pants to the audience. I want to talk
a very low opinion of you.
I want to talk about. One or two of them have shown me their M&S bags. I want to talk about the BBC. I am a slavish lover of public service broadcasting and a slavish lover of the BBC, but I'm also a huge critic of the BBC. And I suspect that you're just the same. You've made various statements. Do you, first of all, let me ask you a straightforward question. Do you believe that we should have a BBC funded by a licence fee and that everyone should pay that licence fee?
Yes.
And do you think that that licence fee should be top-sliced and given to other so-called public service broadcasters like Channel 4 or whoever applies for it?
No.
And do you therefore feel that, we didn't rehearse this, and do you therefore...
Never ask yes/no questions unless you want yes/no answers.
No, I know, this is, I'm learning from the interview here how not to do it.
No, I think it's fine, but I think you're entitled to straight answers.
But now that we are facing all sorts of problems with the BBC, do you feel that the BBC itself currently is earning enough respect from the public to ensure that it gets that licence fee? Much more difficult question.
That is a more difficult question, and because I can only answer it incredibly subjectively. I mean, you're asking for a value judgment, whereas previously you're asking for statements of principle. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, let me give you what would doubtless be considered by many serious people in this room a trivial example. I took my younger daughter to the final of Strictly Come Dancing, and I tell you, that is a bloody well-produced show, which I think would in itself justify the licence fee for a month. So I think,
but many people would say, all right, that's good, because we got into an argument straight away. Some people say, I was debating this with David Elstein on radio the other day, he made exactly the opposite remark. Look, how you buggers can justify having the licence fee, he more or less said, when you've got Strictly Come Dancing. That's entertainment, that should be done by other people.
Yeah.
And why are the BBC making it?
Because it's not being done by other people, Roy.
Okay.
There are other entertainment programmes. I mean, the X Factor I thought was actually a quite well produced, in my judgment, slightly less well produced, but pretty well produced show. But no, I used to very strongly take the view that the BBC should only do those things which cannot be done by the market. And I would be perfectly happy in that, and Newsnight would survive in that role. But I do see the force of the argument, I suppose, that you have, if you impose by force of law a tax upon people, you must be seen to provide fare that is accessible to all.
Yeah.
I have a big problem with many of the things that the BBC has done in pursuing that remit, but I should also have to accept, as I would hope that people would be occasionally tolerant when I make a complete mess of an interview, I must also accept that there are going to be mistakes made in commissioning processes. I mean, there was a period last year when Newsnight had to follow an hour-long programme, or maybe it was an hour and a half, on celebrity dog walking. I mean, a ludicrous proposition. It went on for about 6 or 8 weeks or something.
Did your audience go up or down?
No, I think actually, Roy, I'm pleased to say it, the audience went up as soon as 10:30 came. Actually, there's another, but talking about, I was going to talk about audiences, but we've had a very interesting experience recently, that the audience has actually gone up the more serious material we've done. The audience has been in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the audience has been rather good. I think it's probably to do with the fact that News at 10 on ITV News at 10 is now back on ITV. And so there's probably some sort of inheritance of people who are sort of interested in news on both channels. But I think it was very striking. We did an incredibly pointy-headed discussion about whether interest rates should be raised, involving a panel of people, including Nigel Lawson and a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee and so on. The audience built during the course of that programme, which I thought was really interesting. It's my firm conviction, and University Challenge would bear this out, where we've deliberately made the questions more difficult, that if you accord the audience the compliment or the respect of saying, you're quite clever enough to understand this, they will very often respond. And it is not necessary to say, look, we think you're a bunch of morons, so here's some pap. It's just not necessary to do that. Now, I recognise mine is a minority view. I work on a minority channel, and it would be a disaster probably if I was put in charge of BBC One or something. But I quite strongly take that view. And the reason I'm against top slicing of the licence fee, for example, is that it's the same reason I'm against advertising on the BBC, which is that if you say such and such a proportion of the licence fee is to be given outside the BBC, or such and such a proportion of the BBC's income is to be taken from advertising, there is no logical reason to stop at a proportion of 5%, 10% or 25%. That you might as well stop at 50% or 95%.
Do you think that you personally, Newsnight generally, the BBC in total, was affected after Hutton, the Hutton report, and the resignation of Greg Dyke and the resignation of Gavin Davis? Do you think you changed, the BBC has changed since then? You got softer, you not being as tough on people?
I don't know. I mean, I am not aware of that. It was a very traumatic time, of course. A very traumatic time. I'm really lucky that I'm on a freelance contract. I have a contract, comes around and says you've got to turn up for 100 and whatever it is days a year, and I'm not therefore required to get involved in internal politics. I'm very happy with that arrangement. Those who do...
I'm going to ask you then, can I just interject here? You're a big celebrity. Do you think that your celebrity status means that you can be, you can act up a bit in terms of the rest of the, you have to obey the rules, you can tell producers to get lost, you do what you like?
People tell producers to get lost all the time. So I don't think that's... I mean, I hate the whole celebrity thing, and I don't like the word, I don't like the concept. It's quite interesting to speculate why it's become such a phenomenon. Personally, I think it's to do with religion, but that's another point. But
absence of religion?
Yeah, I think so. It's to do with significance, the frenetic desire for some significance. But anyway, that's another matter. But I mean, others will. You should ask somebody else that question, because I behave as I behave, and I'm not aware of doing it because...
You're quite naughty sometimes. I remember when you had to read out the weather, you kind of really pissed on it, to be honest.
Well, you see, I just think you're wrong. I'm sorry to say this, Roy, but I think you've got the wrong end of the stick there, because I actually was in favour of... This is interesting. This is no interest to anybody. This is a question... Okay, I'll give you the 1-minute version. We have to do the markets. This was a Burt edict brought in that we had to report the markets every night. There came a point where I and various others said, look, anyone who needs to know the markets knows the markets. Let's not do it. Let's do something useful. Let's have the weather. We had the weather, and unfortunately there was a bit of a sort of tension with the people who produced the weather forecast, and they used to give us a rather bare-bones sort of summary of what it was going to be. So it's true that I did say, when the forecast for some April day was showers, it's April, what do you expect? Now, that is not because I didn't want to do the weather forecast. I wanted to do the weather forecast.
So I misread that,
yeah. No, I mean, it's a very important matter, this. I wanted the weather forecast. But unfortunately, our damn fool editor at the time, still our damn fool editor, decided to put it out to a vote of the audience, or such members of the audience as chose to take part in the vote on our website, probably not much larger than the number of people in this room. And there was a victory for the markets. A terrible injustice was done. But we had to abide by it.
Give him back the weather. I'm going to open it out because I could go on talking like this forever. I think when you get down to the weather, as Jeremy suggests, maybe I've gone too far. Any questions? I'll carry on if you don't. Yeah, okay, here. Well, we have a microphone coming. The reason we want the microphone is because it's being recorded and your voice will make a difference. If you want to say who you are, or you want to keep secret who you are, it's up to you.
Jerry Mankiewicz. Jerry, I find it very difficult to believe that you're not primed by your production staff, that you don't have some bullet points, and just a quick guide to whoever you're going to interview.
Oh God, I didn't mean to give that impression at all. I'm a glove puppet. No, I mean, of course, I'm so sorry if I did not mean to give that impression at all. No. What happens if we're doing a, sorry, you hang on the microphone, but if there's a piece being done and there's an interview, then there will be a brief. The question is what you do beyond that, and quite frequently I don't do enough. No, but of course, no, I mean, not every time there's a brief, but most times, if it's anything serious, there is a brief. If it's a sort of set-piece interview about a subject, yeah, there'd usually be. I mean, yeah, there are lots of occasions on which it doesn't happen, but by and large that does happen, yes.
I got the wrong impression when you said I've gone darling in 5 minutes.
Oh, there was no brief on that occasion. Yeah.
What would you like to be doing in 5 years' time?
I haven't the faintest idea. I'd like to be alive in 5 years. Sorry, what would I like?
What would you like to be doing in 5 years' time?
No, I got it first time. I'd like to be alive, really. I think that's all. I think I can't. I've just been. I'm a very gloomy bugger on occasions, and that's not attractive. But I would have to accept, in any rational analysis of my life, I've been incredibly lucky. Incredibly lucky, and I've never had a plan. I've done things that seemed interesting at the time. Roy, not very much recently. Everything, I've been there 18 years, but you know, I've just done things that seemed interesting at the time, and I've been incredibly fortunate. So you know, maybe I've had my allocation of good luck, but I'm quite happy as I am. I think. I mean, I'm seething with inner discontent and anger.
Is that because you not caught the fish you really want to catch?
Yeah. No, actually, that doesn't make me angry at all. Actually, fishing is another matter altogether. I never get angry about that. I got very angry on the Circle line earlier this evening.
So did I. Did you get shoved off your train as well?
Or to Gloucester Road?
Yeah.
No, I was trying to get on at Gloucester Road. It was you, was it? Yeah. No, seriously, I was trying to get on. And, no, it was very irritating. And then there was that bloody crowd of Russian or Serbian school children. I wanted to garrote them all.
A liberal speaks.
No, I don't care where they come from. They were just in the way.
Next, please. The gentleman over there. I'll come back to you, sir.
What I'd really like to ask you is whether it's true you lived in my granny's house in Belfast, but maybe we can go back to that one later. Could you please...
Where was the house? I'll tell you.
Belmont.
Oh, yeah, I did, yeah. Oh, no, just off the old Hollywood Road.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did live there. Yeah, I lived in the ground floor flat.
Correct.
Gee, that was a bloody great house, that.
Yes, it was.
But the ceilings were always falling down. Yeah. I lived there. Unfortunately, I had to leave after a row with the chap I shared with over the purchase of loo paper.
Misconfirmed. Of more broad interest, could you please develop the celebrity religion point? Because I think I read as recently as this Sunday, somebody did a book review of your latest book, and there was a suggestion you had started church going at this stage in your life, and I'd like to see what your thoughts are on that. So there were some nodding heads in the audience when you started on that point earlier.
I'm just nodding off. Well, no, I don't know where you read this review. I haven't had a book out for over a year, but anyway, the Belmont Times, I suppose. No, it's not true. I did start going back to church about, 15 years ago or something. So it's very up to speed. And I went for about 5 years, and then I concluded I was an atheist. And I then had a wonderful conversation with the vicar, a really great guy, poll tax rebel, and he was a terrific man. And I said to him, I said, look, Paul, I think I should have the courage to tell you to your face that I'm not going to be coming to church anymore. And he said, why is that? And I said, well, I don't believe. And he said, well, this is very positive. Only in the Church of England could this happen. So I said, I've obviously not made myself clear. I'm saying I don't think there's anybody up there. And he said, no, marvellous, 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 terrific. And I thought, yeah, that's why the Church of England is a wonderful institution. And so that's not true. But on the broad, the point about celebrity, I think that one comes across it now quite a lot in young people who have an undifferentiated desire to achieve fame. I remember once I first came across it. This is very recent, this whole celebrity thing, like the last 5 or 6 years. I first came across it about 10 years ago when we had a team on University Challenge from, I think they were from Girton at Cambridge. No, it was a women's college. Maybe I can't remember which college it was. After they weren't terribly good, but when we were having a drink afterwards, one of them came up to me and said, I want your job. And I said, well, I've no doubt you probably have it one day. Well, which bit are you interested in? And she said, well, I don't really mind. I said, well, I'm really a journalist. That's what I do, and I just do this for fun. And she said, well, I don't mind. I just want to be on television. So I said, well, I think you should maybe think a bit more clearly about what you want to do with your life. And she said, I was at school with the girl who shows off the prizes on Bruce's big night. It was a Bruce Forsyth Saturday night vehicle, didn't last very long. And I look at her and I think, life's so unfair. That could have been me. I just couldn't believe it. And I said, look, I don't get it. You're at one of the best universities in the world and you're jealous of someone who appears in some sequined outfit showing off the prizes on a game show. And she said, yes. And I thought then, why is this person like this? And I think it's to do with the fact that outside of work, and work is a very, in institutional terms, organizational terms, it's a very bad place to get your sense of self-worth. The fact that your boss has promoted you or pats you on the back, although it's obviously gratifying to anybody, but you must have some inner sense of purpose yourself. That outside of work there are so few areas of life now in which people can feel any kind of validation. And that is why, because it is so public, it erupts in this spectacular burst of light, celebrity, that I think because we've completely lost, not completely lost, we have largely lost that quieter sense of purpose and being loved, that it's become such a kind of terrible epidemic now. You may say, you may think it's a complete nonsense. I merely air it as my incoherent ramblings on the subject, but I think there's something in there. I don't put it very well, but I think there's something in there.
There was a gentleman over there.
Who's been the most difficult person that you've interviewed and why? And leading on from that, there's a point in interviews where they're simply not answering the question, and how do you decide to move on? At that point, do you feel that they've won?
I can't answer the question of who's the most difficult. because the most difficult one is always the one you're just about to do. So I can't, and like most journalists, I've got a very, very short attention span. So, you know, if we were doing something tonight about the guano exports of Ecuador, I'd know about the guano exports of Ecuador, but I wouldn't know about it by tomorrow night. So I think remembering, singling out individuals, you know, you go back a very long way. The further back they are in time, the more one remembers. Martha Scargill was, you know, difficult to interview. Virginia Bottomley could be difficult to interview, and Blair could be difficult to interview. You know, the dozens. But these are pointlessly selective highlights. I think, by and large, the thing that makes me feel, that makes me apprehensive is the one that you're just about to do. So I don't have any great list of particularly difficult or indeed easy people to interview. And if you were to say who's been the most satisfying person to interview, I equally couldn't really answer that, I think, properly.
Most impressive?
I couldn't answer that either.
Everyone says Mandela, but if you don't, I don't know.
I've never interviewed Mandela, so there's a very, very long list of people I haven't interviewed. So I can't really answer these questions satisfactorily. I think it would almost certainly be that the more interesting people to interview are people who are religious, spiritual, who are concerned with the really, really big questions rather than the much smaller questions about how we organise our lives or run a transport system. I think I'd say that. On the question of if you don't get someone to ask a question, do you feel you have lost? I don't. I mean, as I've already tried to indicate, I don't view all interviews as fisticuffs, as gladiatorial combat. And so there's not really a question of winning or losing. I mean, sometimes there is, of course, occasionally, but by and large, most of them aren't like that. So the point at which you fail to get them to answer a question, you know, you have got the perfect choice to ask it again. If you choose not to ask it again, you've made a judgment. The judgment may be wrong. You've made a judgment that it's quite clear they're not answering it. So, no, I don't think so. I definitely don't feel defeated.
Can I ask you a rather personal question? Going back to our past, I remember a young man at my table in Brighton who was incredibly idealistic, and there's nothing at all wrong with that. I'm saying you're not idealistic now, but I wonder if in the mellowing process that seems to happen to all of us. And what you said about anger and feeling anger, that you're disappointed about the way the world has gone since we've been here. Only a small question to deal with.
God, I don't think I'm going to venture into this terrain, actually, Roy.
That's for dinner.
Well, I think it's for dinner, and you know, one could say an awful lot of ridiculous things. More than one hasn't done already, but no, I don't think so.
You changed your mind. Let me ask you a different way. You changed in your book about royalty. You seemed to change your mind about royalty.
I did.
You've become, dare I say it, a bit small c conservative, or do you think that they perform a very special function?
Well, as an old trot, I thought you might bring that up, Roy.
Old Maoist, actually.
Maoist, I'm so sorry.
Let's get these delineations correct.
And you're still a Republican, I believe.
I am, yeah.
Yeah. No, I was a Republican until I started working on that book, and then I changed my mind. And I mean, you know, one always used to, at the age of, 25 or something, have the view that increasing conservatism was to do with the loss of brain cells, which we know is a physiological fact. But now I've lost an awful lot of brain cells. Maybe that's what's happened. I don't think so. I think that what happened, and I think it would happen to you, and we can again talk about this over dinner if you wish. I think if you subjected, I mean, I'm with you 100% theoretically on the question of whether we should ever have a crowned head of state. But it's just that when you come to think through the practicalities of the matter, from where we are now, you come to a different conclusion. Now, you may say that that's a sign of conservatism. I don't think it is, but I think it's a sign of freshness. I think it would have been conservative of me to have stuck with the prejudice I'd had since I was 14, which was that it was indefensible to have an unelected head of state. That would have been conservative.
Yeah, changing your mind is a valuable thing.
I think so, yeah.
Politicians don't like to say that, do they? I remember, you know, that's one of the things that one notices about interviews. You're just willing the guy or the woman to say, well, on that subject, I guess we've changed our minds. They don't like to say that.
No,
and
they
you
don't.
try to force them to say it, give them the opportunity to say it, but they won't say it.
No, I think that's true. Although yes, it's much more difficult in government. Although there are people in government who've said that. I mean, I remember interviewing Jack Straw about prisons, and in opposition he had said he was against private prisons, and when he got to be Home Secretary in the Blair government, he espoused private prisons, and he did say on the record, on air, yes, I used to think that, and now I've changed my mind. And you know, I think that's, whether one agrees with the way he's changed his mind is neither here nor there. But the admission that he's changed his mind, or the acceptance he's changed his mind, he says as much. I mean, if he had said, no, I never said that, and you then had to quote him the verse, that would be another matter, or if he was guilty of hypocrisy. But to say openly, yes, I did think that, and now I think that. Was it Keynes, wasn't it? He said, when confronted with the facts that do not suit my prejudice, I change my mind, what do you do?
Yes.
I think it's rather a sensible way to approach life.
Well, I ask you a question you couldn't answer. It was an unfair question about changes in your political attitude or mellowing or whatever. But let me ask you a straightforward question about journalism. You've been a journalist a long time now, and we've discussed how long. But anyway, and we both have. Do you think that journalism, and there's two questions coming really. Do you think journalism has got worse, more trivial, one accusation, or do you think that it is the case that the audience have changed, that their requirements have changed, and therefore journalism has changed to meet them?
I think it's unarguable that journalism has become more trivial, viz. The pants story.
Yeah.
You know, it's undoubtedly the case. If you compare a copy of the Times now with a copy of the Times from even 15 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, it is a sad, thin thing now. There isn't the breadth of foreign coverage in any of the newspapers there used to be, and you know, we're all familiar with what's happened. So I think, yes, I do think that's the case. Why is that? Well, I suppose it's the consequence of market forces. What do people want to read in their newspapers? Well, they want to read. Clearly they want to read features. They want to be amused. They want to read opinion. It's not. And I would also say they want to read fresh journalism.
My belief is, you see, that newspapers set the agenda for you broadcasters. And therefore, does that not suggest that perhaps broadcasting itself has become more trivial too?
I think that I think that's a slightly dated view. Alistair certainly had the same view, that if you control
we share that view. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you're like that, aren't you?
That's so untrue. But anyway,
I know. I'm just teasing you. No, I mean, he felt that if you controlled what went into the morning papers, you could then dominate what appeared on the news bulletins, certainly in the early part of the day, and after that it was a question of orchestrating announcements by various ministers during the course of the day. And he was quite effective at it. I think it is changing. I think, for example, I mean, the Channel 4 News lead tonight is that the government is going to make phone tap evidence admissible in court. I find it inconceivable that that won't be picked up with certainly the serious papers tomorrow morning. So I don't think it's a one-way traffic. I do think when you find yourself at the centre of a story, and as none of you has mentioned pants, I will. But when that happened, the guy from the Mail, the first phase is the guy from the Mail on Sunday rings up on Thursday or Friday afternoon. I was pretty cross about it. The second phase is the story appears, and then you get various people from other newspapers ringing up, trying to present the story, getting quotes, trying to present the story as their own. The third phase, and only the third phase, is then the broadcasters getting involved. And then you get the Today programme and Channel 4 News and Channel 5 News and so on. Will you come on and discuss underwear? Well, of course I want to come on and discuss underwear, but you know, and then it goes on till you get to the point which is the least comfortable one, which is about the fifth phase, which is let's shitbag the original source, which is when you get the the uncomplimentary profiles and so on. Now, in that, I mean, that sequence of events tends to bear out your theory.
Yeah.
But that's a certain kind of story, and I think that I think it's a fair criticism in that kind of story. I don't think it's a fair criticism in many other kinds of stories. I think in politics in particular, it tends to be something else.
Okay, we have another audience member. The microphone's on its way.
Hi, considering the fact that today's Super Tuesday, if you had Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain around your desk, your desk, what question would you ask each of them?
Why haven't I got a brief? I mean, I think, I'll tell you what I would ask, I don't know, I read this, that sort of thing will never happen, for the simple reason that there are no votes in it. There are no votes in broadcasting to a British audience. So it's not going to happen. But in the unlikely event that it were going to happen, it would have been the consequence of a great deal of prior negotiation and some planning. But it strikes me that the interesting thing that I would like to know the answer to, as between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, is what precisely they differ on. Now, we can cite things in their voting records, but I would like to know that very much. And then, I mean, all the obvious issues after that, it seems to me. But to try to define something beyond this question of the choice between a woman and a black person would be kind of interesting and useful. But sad to relate, I'll bet my house it's not going to happen.
Well, you've had a chance. I'll come back to you. Gentleman over there.
Going back to the much smaller world of game shows and quizzes, I wonder whether you were actually surprised when the principal, the great principal of BBC, was caught out in some sharp practice, or whether you had sensed some kind of erosion of principles creeping up on the BBC before then.
Was I surprised? Yes, I was surprised. And when you hear, I don't know whether you've heard the recording of the particularly egregious one, which is on, I can't remember, was it Radio 6 or Radio...
Radio 6, the one where she offers prizes.
And she's not even there.
She's not even there. Yeah.
I have simply no idea what was going on. But I think it's very, very, very unfair it's understandable, but I also think it is unfair and illegitimate to blacken everybody with what happened. It's an enormous organisation. I'd never heard of it is Radio 6.
It is, yeah.
I didn't know Radio 6 existed, but there are major scandals like the naming of the Blue Peter cat. Well, pause for thought there, eh?
Sooty business. There was somebody over there, yeah.
Over the 18 years, we were talking about the interviewees that are now pre-trained. Does that make your job more difficult, or have you noticed a difference over that period of time, that because interviewees are now sort of pre-programmed, that it makes it more difficult to get the information that you want out of them, and they're always trying to put across their own agenda?
And does it make life more difficult? I don't think so. My own incompetence makes it more difficult, but no, I don't feel that. No. And I don't say they were never trained, because I don't really know what happened 20, 25 years ago. But I think it's certainly the case now. It probably happened to a smaller group previously, but I'm not aware of it making life more difficult.
Okay, I'll take you again. Yeah.
Now, leading on from Roy's last question about trivialisation, would you agree, and this is about written journalists, not broadcast journalists, that in as much as we keep the politicians in check, we need to give them in check, because they present the average public with a cartoon view of the rest of the world. People think that George Bush is a buffoon, a cartoon character. He isn't really. People think that the average Iranian is a monster. Everything is demonised and put in extremes, extreme black and white. But we don't see that the rest of the world are pretty ordinary people with the same concerns that you and I have. And I want you to see this from the point of view of the man in the street.
Yeah. What are you saying? Do I agree with you?
Yeah.
Yeah, up to a point, but only up to a point. I think people read newspapers quite sophisticatedly, and they do not believe that all Iranians want to, drop a nuclear bomb on us, for example. And I think because I think they understand the basic, or one of the basic laws of journalism, which is that news is things that are out of the ordinary. Now, I fully accept that by and large we live in a language of extremes, that a minister is never embarrassed, he's always humiliated, that there's never a sort of subtle change of direction, there's always a humiliating climb down. This sort of language doesn't really help our understanding. But sometimes people say, well, the news presents such an unremittingly bleak view of the world that people have an utterly distorted, it's a slight variant on your argument, people have an utterly distorted idea of what reality is. I think the answer to that is to invite people to consider the alternative, which is that it is remarkable that 67 million people were not murdered in their beds last night. If that's a news story, imagine the kind of world that we're living in. What's newsworthy is the fact that one or two were murdered in their beds. That's why it's clearly it's aberrant behaviour that makes news. And my point is, I think, merely that people understand that, people recognise it. So I don't think it does entirely warp their view of the world. No.
You don't think that groups of people can be demonised by drip, drip, drip in papers and on the media every day?
Well, who's been demonised?
Muslims.
What, all Muslims?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I don't believe that,
okay.
Clearly.
We disagree. Is it not possible then, I mean, look, let's look back then. We know that Germans were demonised in 1914 in the lead up to the First World War. We know that atrocities were mentioned, propaganda was laid. We know the same thing happened in the 30s. So why should it be that it doesn't happen now and it did happen then?
That's a ludicrous argument, Roy. Because it's happened in the past, it must be happening now. You don't believe that.
Up to a point, Lord Copper, I do. Look, the point I'm making is not the specific one, but the possibility that it could happen. Why, if it has happened before, could it not happen again?
Well, that's another argument altogether. Could it happen again? I suppose it could happen again.
And then if it could happen again, why do you think that it's not I mean, why are you so certain that it's not happening now? Simply by rejecting the argument that it's happening is just simply to say, I don't agree that it's happening, but not analysis.
But I don't agree that it's happening, because you've yet to produce any evidence.
Okay.
Well, and we can share the evidence about 1914, 1915.
Yep.
Demonisation of the Bosch. Because there is evidence about that. But I don't think. No, I don't think that's the case.
So everything's just tickety-boo then?
No, that isn't what I said at all. That's just a typical bloody journalistic distortion. You people are appalling.
That's our job, I think, you say. Over there.
Hello, I just want to ask what have you learned from 18 years of doing interviews, and how do you think your style has changed? And just finally, what would be your advice to new journalists going into the industry?
Don't. Honestly, it would just be A, dishonest, and B, self-regarding, even if I could remember what I'd learned in the years of doing it. I mean, I suppose, I'll give you one practical piece of advice. If you are embarking upon a journalistic endeavour of whatever kind, whether you've got a, there you are, write up the local flower show, or report a funeral, or interview George Bush, remember what it is you want to find out. That's all. It's really, really simple, but it's very, very easy to get sidetracked. But you must try to remember that. That's the way I find I can work. And on the question of whether advice for people going into the trade, well, I would say I get a lot of letters and emails from people who want to start in journalism in one form or another. And by and large, I try to put them all off. I do my utmost to put them off. The business has become casualized. There are apparently respectable journalistic institutions which exploit in the most disgraceful fashion people on work experience. It therefore becomes a trade that can only be entered into relatively easily by those who've got some sort of backing, which is again undesirable. The prospects in it are very poor. There is no longevity in it of any kind unless you're incredibly fortunate. I mean, my contemporaries, I'm very old now. I've done it a very long time. But most of my contemporaries are not doing it anymore. And we were a pretty lucky cohort. So it has no longevity in it, and you will never become rich. Go and do something like, go and do something that involves making some money, employing people, doing something socially worthwhile. So I say all of that slightly more concisely, in the certain knowledge that if you really want to do it, you will do it, and nothing that I say will put them off. But it's important that they are put off if they have the slightest doubt about it, because it is going to get worse in my view. We haven't talked about so-called citizen journalism and the rest of it, but at a point when everybody thinks they can do it, at a point when employers and great journalistic institutions seem to me to have lost sight of what they ought to be doing and are now purely in it as a commercial game. These are bad times to be going into the trade. I'm not saying that it is a bad trade. It's a wonderful thing. It's given me a marvelous. I've loved it. As I said earlier, I think I've been incredibly lucky. I've absolutely adored it. And the fact that any of us in this room, I assume we're all hacks. The fact that you can, with some sense of entitlement, go anywhere, ask anybody anything, is the most marvelous. It's a marvelous, marvelous occupation. If in addition to that you can occasionally turn a satisfactory sentence or get a revelatory answer out of somebody, then life is complete. It's a wonderful, wonderful trade. But I don't think people should be under any illusions about how tough it is. It is tough. Well, you see students going into it, Roy, much more than I do, but it's tough, isn't it?
No, it's tough on them, yeah.
Very tough.
I know how exploited they can be. I'm glad you mentioned citizen journalism. We might come back to that. I'll just see if there are any more questions, yeah? Well, there's one at the far back, and okay, take this gentleman in the brown shirt, and then there's a young man at the back.
You mentioned students, and obviously you wouldn't have been a student journalist yourself. Do you think these courses, the fact that journalism has now become a university course, is a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a waste of a university education, but I was a student journalist. I was a student, and worked on and then edited the student newspaper. I just think 3 years of your life, it's unfortunate if you spend them merely acquiring, I mean, you might say lawyers do it, engineers do it, doctors do it, but we're not at that level, actually. The tricks of journalism are really, really simple to learn. It does not take 3 years. You can learn them in 3 weeks. So, and I think it's a waste of 3 years. 3 years complete latitude to read and talk and shoot the breeze. Shame to waste it on learning what really are mechanical skills.
If you were interviewing me, I'd answer that, but I won't come back too strongly. There are journalism educators here who would definitely disagree. I'd take that question at the back, please.
How would you propose restoring an interest in politics in young people who don't come from an affluent background? I mean, I go to a state school in London that is one of the highest achieving ones, but if I were to ask in my year how many watch Newsnight or read a newspaper, it'd be a very small proportion.
Well, it's not compulsory to watch Newsnight. Might improve our audience if it were, I suppose, but no, it's, I mean, I just don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think this is really an issue. Politicians are always going on, or have been going on for some time now, about the disengagement of youth from politics. When I was a teenager, I had no interest in politics. Politics seemed to me to be practiced by this ossified tribe of people with whom I could scarcely identify as fellow members of the human race. So I don't think that's at all unusual. And young people have got lots of other things they choose to do with their time, whether they be sport or academic or just having fun. So I think this is not something that needs exercises over much. And I'm not sure that ideas like, for example, lowering the voting age to 16 is any way to go at all. It's perfectly natural, it seems to me. I had no interest actually in British domestic politics. At the time we knew each other, I absolutely first knew each other. I had no interest at all in British domestic politics and did a lot of work in the early years of my journalistic career basically abroad. I think I was well into my 30s before almost before I'd met a British politician. I don't think this is surprising, and I don't think it's necessarily concerning. But you obviously feel differently. I mean, you do feel involved, and you know, I salute you. I salute you for it. But you mustn't think that all your friends or contemporaries are somehow inferior because they happen to take a different view.
Okay, we're nearly there. Your failure to identify with politicians in those days reminds me that I find it very difficult to identify with Hazel Blears.
Oh, what a woman.
What a woman. One more. I'll take 2 more questions. There and there.
Hello, Jeremy. Very nice to see you here. And can I argue? I want to argue. I'm a student from Goldsmiths, and I study television journalism master degree. And I don't think 3 weeks is enough for training a professional journalist, because we have lots of things. Sorry, we have lots of things to learn about media law and about some good attitude. How can you to be a good journalist? For example, you must learn something about bias and balance and objectivities. I think that's very valuable characters, although for journalists or for women or for men. Thank you.
Okay.
And finally, because next week we're going to do a television program for practice.
No,
called
God, I know
News
where
Night.
this is going.
And I will be the news presenter. Could you please kindly give me some tips?
Okay, 4 weeks then. In the end, my feeling, you have got to learn the law. You've got to learn 1 or 2 technical things. You know, how to operate a tape recorder or how to use a camera. That may take a week, I suppose. Where are we up? This is 2 weeks. Shorthand, you don't. I mean, you don't need to need shorthand anymore. But I suppose that may take another day or two. But the basic requirement cannot be taught. The basic requirement is curiosity, and curiosity can't be taught. If you're not intrinsically curious, you will never make a decent journalist. And I think, you know, I think that's enough, really. And that would be the advice I would give you. Actually, I hate old farts sitting around giving advice, so I'm sure you'll be wonderful at it.
I'm going to take one last, hopefully quick question.
I'll try and make it quick. By the way, I'm a politics student at 15. I've got 2 sons at the university doing journalism, so big advice. My question was, if you chose to interview somebody or have dinner with somebody, who would it be, historically, otherwise?
Oh God, I'm going to give
a politician.
Well, you know, everybody always gives the same answers to these questions, don't they? It's always, no, it's nothing wrong with the question. I'm merely reflecting on the poverty of the examples that I would give just confronted with a question like that out of the blue. You know, the Pope would be interesting to sit down and shoot the breeze with, wouldn't he? Then they default to Hitler. Charles Dickens, actually, I'm reading Hard Times at present, and I'd love to. Do you know Dickens was dead at 58? I think dinner with Dickens would be all right. I mean, I can't give you a considered answer. There were so many people who'd be interesting.
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to call it to a halt there because we've reached time. I just want to ask you just one question which touches on some of the things people have asked, and you kind of wiped aside quite nicely. But it's about, you mentioned citizen journalism, but about convergence, really. We're now multi-platform journalists, supposedly, all those people on the papers running about with video cameras and doing blogs and texts and sending stuff by mobile phone, learning how to podcast and so on. Are we, in your view, are we moving towards the point at which radio, television, newspapers will all come together and we'll all be looking at a single screen?
I mean, I'm very familiar with this argument, and the short answer is I don't know. The BBC is currently being reorganised on the basis that it will all converge.
Yeah.
And in the news department, it's all being reorganised, and people are supposed to be, multi-skilled in all these things. Well, I admire them for having come to a conclusion on the matter, which is a wholesale improvement on the position the organisation often finds itself in. So they've come to a view on it. Whether it's the right conclusion to come to, I don't know. And none of us knows. All I think I observe is that I watch things on a screen, and I increasingly read newspapers on a screen, but I don't watch television on a screen. And these models tend to be built around teenagers. Because 17-year-olds or 15-year-olds are watching YouTube on a screen in their bedroom, is held somehow to presage the fact that there will come a point at which the television doesn't exist in the sitting room. Now, it seems to me that this ignores a basic truth about teenagers, which is that they have always hung around in darkened bedrooms, probably doing much worse things than watching a screen. And I'm not sure that this is a really sensible business model for adults, because there's a certain aspect and it is based almost always upon teenagers, this huge anxiety. It's how they watch it, and it's what they watch. It's the fact that they choose to watch YouTube and commune on Facebook or Bebo or whatever it is. Well, yes, they do. It's an observable fact. Any of us who are familiar with teenagers know they do this. Are they going to do that for the rest of their lives? Do you do what you did at the age of 16 now? I think that's a rather more moot point. And I think something happens to the way that you take information, assuming the information is worth taking communally. People tend to take it communally. So I think the experience is different. So I think there's a very, very big flaw in this argument. It's rather like the way in which, it's not entirely like, it's vaguely like the way that breakfast television was invented in this country. It was invented by British broadcasting executives who'd gone to the United States, stayed in hotel rooms, and observed that breakfast television existed. They then imported it here, without recognizing that most people don't live in hotel rooms. So I think that, and I think there's a big, big question mark about the assumptions that are being made. But do I say I'm right? I have no idea.
Great. I'd like just to thank Jeremy Paxman for a fantastically entertaining hour and a half.